In the glittering, gaslit world of 1838 London, a single evening could seal a young lady's fate. For Lady Seraphina Covington, the night of the Ashworth ball was not about finding a husband, it was about survival. With her family's name hanging by a thread, her future rested on the seams of a single, hand-me-down gown. But she never could have imagined that a malicious tear, a moment of profound public humiliation, would catch the eye of the one man in England everyone feared and desired, the cold, untouchable Alastair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. This isn't just a story of a torn dress. It's the story of how a calculated act of cruelty led to a love that would defy an entire society. The scent of beeswax and old money clung to the air in the narrow Covington townhouse at number 17, Bloomsbury Square. It was a respectable address, but one that held the faint, persistent ghost of better days. For Lady Seraphina Covington, that ghost was particularly active this evening, whispering through the halls as her mother, Lady Annalise, pulled the laces of her corset with a grim determination. "Tighter, Martha," Annalise commanded the maid, her voice strained. A lady's posture is her first line of defense. Seraphina drew a sharp, shallow breath, her ribs feeling like a cage for a frantic bird. "Mother, I can scarcely breathe." "Breathing is a luxury, Seraphina. A successful match is a necessity." Annalise stepped back, her eyes, once the toast of London society, now etched with fine lines of worry, critically assessing her daughter's reflection. The Covington fortune, built on shipping and savvy investments by Seraphina's grandfather, had been all but squandered by her father, Lord Julian Covington. A man with a kind heart and a disastrous head for business, he had chased one speculative venture after another into ruin. They weren't destitute, not yet, but they were perilously close. They had sold their country estate, let go of most of their staff, and now their last hope was pinned on Seraphina, making a brilliant match during her second London season. Her first had been a quiet failure, eclipsed by wealthier, more dazzling debutantes. This ball, the annual event hosted by the formidable Countess of Ashworth, was the pinnacle of the season. An invitation was a mark of social acceptance, and for the Covingtons, it was a final, desperate roll of the dice. The gown was the centerpiece of this gamble. It had been Annalise's own from a decade prior, a beautiful creation of watered silk in a shade of pale moonlight. Its sleeves had been updated, its waistline lowered to match the current fashion, but it could not hide its age from a discerning eye. It was lovely, but it was not new. In a ballroom where young ladies wore their fathers' fortunes in the form of French lace and glittering jewels, Seraphina's dress was a quiet admission of their circumstances. "You look beautiful, my dear," Annalise said, her voice softening as she smoothed a stray lock of Seraphina's honey-blonde hair. "Remember what I told you. Smile, but not too broadly. Laugh, but like a whisper. And for heaven's sake, do not discuss literature or politics with the young gentlemen. They find it terribly unsettling." Seraphina nodded, her throat tight. She loved books, she had opinions on the corn laws, and she found the vapid chatter of most eligible bachelors to be soul-crushingly dull. But she understood the game she had to play. Tonight, she was not Seraphina Covington, a woman of intellect and quiet passions. She was a product to be sold, a beautiful, placid creature with a good name, and, hopefully, a face pretty enough to make some lord forget her lack of dowry. Her father appeared in the doorway, his kind face drawn. "The carriage is waiting." He avoided looking at his wife's anxious expression, instead offering his arm to his daughter. "You will be the loveliest flower in the garden, Fana." As they descended the worn staircase, the name that had been on everyone's lips for the entire season echoed in Seraphina's mind. Blackwood. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, was a legend swathed in black broadcloth and chilling indifference. He had inherited his title and a fortune so vast it was considered vulgar to even speculate upon its size. He was devastatingly handsome, with eyes the colour of a stormy sea and a jaw that looked as if it had been carved from granite. But he was also cold, remote, and utterly unapproachable. He attended social events as if they were a penance, his presence a dark, silent judgment upon the frivolity around him. Mothers despaired, for he danced with no one, spoke to few, and looked at every hopeful debutante as if she were a particularly uninteresting piece of furniture. They said a tragedy in his youth had frozen his heart, that he was incapable of love. But that didn't stop every family in England from dreaming of thawing him. Should the Duke of Blackwood be in attendance, her mother had instructed, in a hushed, reverent tone, you will not stare. You will not approach him. Men of his stature and temperament do the choosing. Simply try to be in his line of sight. And appear serene. Seraphina thought it a fool's errand. The Duke of Blackwood would never look twice at a girl in a 10-year-old dress from Bloomsbury Square. Her goal tonight was more realistic, to perhaps charm a viscount or a wealthy baron's son. Someone kind, someone who could save her family. Love was a fantasy she had packed away with her girlhood novels. Tonight was about duty. As she stepped into the hired carriage, the delicate silk of her skirt brushing against the worn leather seat, she felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver of dread. It was as if the threads of her dress were holding not just her modesty, but the entire fragile future of her family in a single, precarious seam. Ashworth House on Grosvenor Square was a palace of light and sound, a world away from the quiet anxieties of Bloomsbury. Hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000 tiny rainbows on the jewels and silks of the assembled guests. A string orchestra played a lively quadrille, its notes weaving through the perfumed air and the constant buzzing hum of high society at play. For a moment, standing at the top of the grand staircase with her parents, Seraphina was overwhelmed. It was a beautiful, terrifying spectacle. She saw fleets of debutantes in gowns of ostentatious white and pastel, their faces masks of practiced innocence. She saw their mothers, the dowagers and matrons, their eyes sharp and calculating as they surveyed the room, assessing alliances and cataloguing rivals. "Deep breath, Seraphina," her mother whispered, giving her a slight nudge forward. "The battle awaits." They made their descent. Lord and Lady Covington were greeted with polite, if slightly cool, familiarity. Seraphina curtsied and smiled, her cheeks already aching from the effort. She accepted a dance with a pimply-faced young lord named Harrington, who trod on her feet twice and spoke only of his horses. She endured another with a widower old enough to be her grandfather, who peered down the front of her gown with rheumy eyes. This was the marketplace, and she was on display. It was during a brief respite, while she was pretending to admire a large, uninspired oil painting, that she first saw him. The Duke of Blackwood stood near a marble column, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. He was exactly as described, tall, dark, and exuding an aura of such profound disinterest that he created a small, empty circle around himself in the otherwise crowded room. People didn't approach him. They eddied around him, like a river flowing around a great, unmovable stone. His gaze swept the room, not with curiosity, but with the weary boredom of a king surveying a court of jesters. Seraphina felt a jolt, an unwilling magnetism. He was magnificent. And in that moment, their eyes met across the glittering expanse. It was for less than a second, but it felt like an eternity. She saw nothing in his expression. No interest, no curiosity, not even disdain. Just a cool, grey assessment. And then he looked away. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had been seen and dismissed in a single glance. A sharp, honeyed voice cut through her thoughts. "Lady Seraphina, what a quaint gown. Is that silk from Lyons?" Seraphina turned to face Lady Isabella Vane, flanked by her two simpering ladies-in-waiting. Isabella was the season's reigning belle, the daughter of an exceedingly wealthy earl. Her gown, a confection of ivory lace and seed pearls, had likely cost more than the Covingtons' entire yearly income. She was beautiful, sharp-featured, and notoriously cruel. "Lady Isabella," Seraphina said, forcing a polite smile. "I believe the silk is English." "Oh, of course," Isabella replied, her tone dripping with false sympathy. She let her eyes trail down Seraphina's figure. "One must support local industry, I suppose, especially when one has little choice." The barb struck home, a flush of heat rising in Seraphina's cheeks. Before she could form a reply, Isabella's gaze flickered past her towards the Duke of Blackwood. A predatory gleam entered her eyes. "You know," Isabella said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, though it was loud enough for those nearby to hear. "They say the Duke values breeding above all else. He requires a true thoroughbred, not some little pony trying to run in a race far above her station." With a final, dismissive smirk, Isabella swept away, her followers trailing in her wake like pilot fish after a shark. Seraphina stood frozen, the insult ringing in her ears. She felt the eyes of those who had overheard the exchange, their pity and amusement a physical weight upon her. This was the cruelty of the ton. It wasn't always a dramatic confrontation. More often it was a slow death by 1,000 cuts, a quiet, public bleeding of one's dignity. She wanted to flee. She wanted to run back to the safety of Bloomsbury, to her books and her quiet life. But then she caught her father's eye from across the room. He looked so hopeful, so proud. She saw her mother, valiantly trying to engage a sour-faced countess in conversation. She couldn't fail them. She couldn't. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she turned away from the painting and forced herself to walk towards the center of the ballroom, her head held high. She would endure. She would smile. She would be serene, even if it shattered her. She was so focused on maintaining her composure, on ignoring the whispers that seemed to follow her, that she didn't notice the way Isabella Vane had begun to move, ever so slowly, to intercept her path. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, and the floor became a swirling vortex of color and movement. Seraphina, having extricated herself from the dance floor, was attempting to make her way to the refreshment table, hoping a glass of lemonade might cool the burning humiliation in her cheeks. The room was a labyrinth of bodies, and she navigated it carefully, mindful of her gown's precious fabric. She saw Lady Isabella Vane ahead, laughing with a group of admirers. Isabella's back was mostly to her. Seraphina tried to give the group a wide berth, intending to slip past them unnoticed. But as she drew level, Isabella made a sudden, theatrical pivot, as if to emphasize a point in her story. Her movement was unnaturally sharp, her body turning, her leg extending just so. The pointed heel of Isabella's satin slipper, adorned with a sharp silver buckle, snagged the delicate hem of Seraphina's skirt. Rai-po-po. The sound was obscene, a violent tearing that cut through the music and the chatter. It was not a small rip. It was a catastrophic failure of fabric. A long, gaping tear ran from the hem all the way up the back of her skirt, stopping just shy of the waistline. The silk, already fragile with age, had given way completely. For a heartbeat, Nothing happened. And then a collective gasp rippled through the guests nearest to them. The music seemed to falter as the dancers in their immediate vicinity slowed, turning to stare. A hush spread outwards from the point of impact, a circle of silence in the cacophony. Serafina froze, her blood turning to ice. She felt a draft of cool air on the back of her legs, a sickeningly intimate exposure. The torn silk gaped open, revealing her petticoat and stockings to the world. She was undone. Every fear, every anxiety she had carried into this ballroom had just materialized in the most visceral way imaginable. She could hear snickers, hastily disguised as coughs. She saw the shock and malicious delight on the faces of Isabella's friends. She was a spectacle, a disaster. Isabella turned, her face a perfect mask of horrified concern. "Oh, my heavens!" she exclaimed, her voice carrying across the silent pocket of the room. "Lady Serafina, I am so dreadfully sorry. How utterly clumsy of me. I must have caught my heel." She bent down, touching the ruined fabric with a show of dismay. "This old silk, it's so very delicate, isn't it?" The insult was as sharp and clean as a surgeon's cut, laying the blame on Serafina's poverty while feigning an apology. The humiliation was absolute. Tears pricked at Serafina's eyes, hot and shameful. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Her only thought was to escape, to run from this gilded room filled with predators. She gathered the torn shreds of her skirt in one hand, trying to cover the gaping hole. She mumbled, It is nothing," and turned to flee, her head down, her world collapsing into a blur of glittering lights and leering faces. Her family was ruined. Her one chance was gone, torn to pieces along with her mother's dress. She would be the cautionary tale of the season, the girl who literally came apart at the seams. She pushed blindly through the crowd, ignoring the whispers and the stares. She had to get out. She had to disappear. But before she could take more than 3 steps towards the exit, her path was blocked by an immovable object. A figure, tall and broad, stepped directly in front of her. A pair of impeccably polished black boots entered her tear-filled line of sight. Slowly, fearfully, she lifted her head. She found herself looking up into the stormy, unreadable eyes of Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He wasn't looking at the horrified expression on her face. He was looking directly, and with a flicker of something she couldn't name, at Lady Isabella Vane, and then his gaze returned to her. The entire ballroom held its breath. The silence that had fallen over their section of the ballroom now seemed to encompass the entire grand hall. The orchestra, sensing a drama far more compelling than their waltz, trailed off into a discordant silence. Every eye was on the Duke of Blackwood and the ruined girl standing before him. Serafina felt her entire body tremble. To be at the center of this scandal was one thing. To have the formidable Duke as its primary witness was another thing entirely. She expected him to turn away in disgust, to offer a curt, cutting remark that would complete her social execution. He did nothing of the sort. His expression remained impassive, but his eyes held hers, a steady, grounding force in the swirling vortex of her shame. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent command for her not to run. Then, in a move that would be spoken of in hushed, astonished tones for decades to come, the Duke of Blackwood did the unthinkable. With fluid, deliberate movements, he shrugged his shoulders, slipping out of his formal black tailcoat. It was a shocking breach of etiquette. A gentleman, a duke no less, never appeared in his shirt sleeves at a formal event. It was tantamount to being undressed. Ignoring the collective gasp that swept the room, He stepped forward. He didn't just hand her the coat. He gently, almost reverently, draped it over her trembling shoulders. The fine wool was heavy and warm, smelling faintly of sandalwood and clean linen. It enveloped her, covering the ripped back of her gown, shielding her from the prying eyes of the ton. The coat was enormous on her small frame, its tails brushing the floor, but it felt like a suit of armor. He leaned in, his voice a low, quiet rumble meant only for her. "Do not give them the satisfaction of your tears, Lady Seraphina." Then he straightened up and offered her his arm, his gloved hand steady and resolute. He raised his voice, not shouting, but with a tone of such quiet, commanding authority that it cut through the silence like a saber. "The air in here has grown rather stale and predictable," he announced to the room at large, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces before landing for a cold, hard second on Lady Isabella Vane. "Lady Seraphina has graciously agreed to accompany me to the terrace for a breath of fresh air." It was not a request. It was a declaration. He was not rescuing her. He was choosing her. He was publicly aligning himself with her, taking her side in the most direct and unambiguous way possible. Seraphina, numb with shock, could do nothing but place her hand on his offered arm. The fabric of his sleeve was firm and strong beneath her trembling fingers. As he turned to lead her away, the crowd parted before them as if by royal decree. The whispers started again, but this time they were not of ridicule, but of stunned, disbelieving awe. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her back, but the weight of the Duke's coat was a shield, his presence a fortress. He led her through the throng, past her parents, whose faces were a comical mixture of horror and hope, past a pale and furious Lady Isabella, and out through the tall French doors that led to the stone-paved terrace. The cool night air was a relief, washing over her hot face. The terrace was deserted, overlooking the manicured gardens of Ashworth House, bathed in moonlight. The distant sounds of the party seemed a world away. Only when the doors had swung shut behind them did the Duke release her arm. He walked to the balustrade, looking out into the darkness, giving her a moment to compose herself. Seraphina clutched the heavy coat around her, the adrenaline and shock finally giving way to a flood of confused emotion. This cold, unapproachable man, this veritable god of London society, had just publicly saved her from utter ruin. But why? She finally found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "Your Grace, I do not know how to thank you." Alistair Beaumont turned to face her, the moonlight catching the sharp planes of his face. For the first time, the mask of cold indifference was gone. In its place was something else, something complex and intense. "Gratitude is not required, Lady Seraphina," he said, his voice softer now. "Decency, however, is. And it was in remarkably short supply in that room tonight." He paused, his stormy eyes searching her face. "Tell me, was her clumsiness as accidental as she claimed?" The question hung in the cool night air, direct and piercing. It offered no room for polite fiction or social niceties. The Duke was not asking what she was supposed to say, but what had actually happened. Seraphina hesitated, the habit of genteel pretense dying hard. "Lady Isabella, she was turning. It was crowded." Alistair's expression didn't change, but a certain hardness entered his eyes. "Do not insult my intelligence, my lady, or your own. I was watching. It was no accident. I ask you again." His insistence on the truth was startling. No one in their world ever spoke so plainly. Looking into his steady gaze, Seraphina felt a lifetime of practiced deference fall away. He deserved the truth. She deserved to speak it. "No, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not an accident. He gave a single, sharp nod, as if she had just confirmed a grim fact he already knew. I thought as well. The Vane family has always mistaken cruelty for wit. He fell silent again, turning his gaze back to the garden. Serafina stood awkwardly, clutching his coat, unsure of what was expected of her. The situation was surreal. Minutes ago, her life was in ruins. Now she was standing on a moonlit terrace with the most powerful and enigmatic man in England, wrapped in his coat. "You are Lord Julian Covington's daughter," he stated, not as a question. "I am." "I knew your grandfather, the old Earl," the Duke continued, his tone conversational. "A shrewd man. He once bested my own father in a deal over shipping rights from the Indies. My father never forgave him for it. He respected him immensely." Serafina was stunned. "You knew my grandfather?" "I was a boy. He was a force of nature. Your father, I understand, does not share his particular talents for commerce." It was a blunt assessment of her family's decline, yet it was said without judgment. It was a simple statement of fact. Again, his directness was both unsettling and strangely liberating. "My father's talents lie in other areas," she replied, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "He is a good man." "Goodness rarely pays the bills, Lady Serafina," Alistair said, turning to face her fully. The moonlight softened the severity of his features, revealing a weariness around his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. "That ballroom," he gestured with his head towards the noise behind them, "is a piranha tank. It survives by devouring the weak, the vulnerable, and the kind. Your father's goodness and your mother's pride make you a target. Tonight was merely the opening salvo." She stared at him, bewildered by his perception. He saw everything. He saw her family's precarious position, the meaning behind Isabella's attack, the very nature of the world she was forced to navigate. "Why did you help me?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "You could have ruined yourself. A duke in his shirt sleeves. People will talk for weeks." A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched his lips. "Let them talk. Their opinions are the least valuable currency I own." The smile vanished. "I helped you because I detest bullies, and because I saw the look on your face when you thought your world was ending. It reminded me of—" He stopped himself, a shadow passing over his face. The infamous tragedy, Serafina thought. It was real. "You showed more dignity in that moment of humiliation than Lady Isabella has shown in her entire life of privilege," he finished, his voice low. "That is a quality I find rare." A warmth bloomed in Serafina's chest, chasing away the last of the evening's chill. It wasn't a compliment on her beauty or her charm. It was an acknowledgement of her character, her strength. From him, it felt more valuable than 1,000 flowery flatteries from other men. They stood in a comfortable silence for a few moments, the music from the ballroom providing a distant backdrop. "I should return this to you," she said softly, making a move to shrug off the heavy coat. "No," he said, his voice firm. "You will wear it until you are safely in your carriage. I will escort you. But my parents, I will send a footman to inform them that you are feeling unwell and that I am seeing you home. They will not object." The unspoken message was clear. No one would dare object to any arrangement he made. He was taking control, managing the fallout of the entire situation with an effortless authority that left her breathless. He was not just shielding her from the gossips. He was rewriting the narrative of the entire evening. She was no longer the poor girl whose dress fell apart. She was the woman who left the ball on the arm of the Duke of Blackwood. He offered his arm again. "Lady Serafina," As she took it, her fingers brushing against his sleeve, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The torn seam of her dress had unraveled her old life, and in its place, something new, terrifying, and utterly exhilarating was beginning to be stitched together. The following morning, London society awoke to a scandal far more delicious than a simple torn dress. The story was on everyone's lips, whispered over breakfast tables, and hastily scribbled in letters. The Duke of Blackwood, the untouchable, the Ice King, had not only intervened on behalf of a minor lady, but had done so by flouting convention in the most dramatic way possible. He had given her his coat. He had escorted her home. The narrative split into two distinct camps. One, championed by Lady Isabella Vane and her ilk, painted Seraphina as a cunning, manipulative upstart who had staged the entire incident to entrap the Duke. The dress was practically designed to fall apart, Isabella was heard to declare at a morning tea, and she practically threw herself into his arms, shameless. The other camp, however, was swept up in the sheer romance of the gesture. They saw a chivalrous duke, a real-life knight in shining armor, rescuing a damsel in distress from the clutches of a villainess. Seraphina became an object of intense curiosity. Who was this quiet girl who had managed to capture the attention of the uncapturable Duke? In the Covington townhouse, the atmosphere was one of bewildered shock. Seraphina had returned home the night before, in the Duke's carriage, wearing his coat, and had recounted the tale to her stunned parents. Her mother had oscillated between horror at the scandal and giddy excitement at the Duke's intervention. Her father had simply been quiet, a deep worry etched on his brow. By midday, the first sign of the Duke's intentions arrived. A footman in the dark green and silver livery of the Blackwood estate delivered a breathtaking bouquet of white roses and a small sealed envelope. Seraphina's hands trembled as she opened it. The note, written in a strong, clear hand, was brief and to the point. Lady Seraphina, I trust you are recovered from last night's unpleasantness. I would be honored if you and your mother would permit me to call upon you this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Yours, Blackwood Annalise, practically swooned. A formal call. The Duke was formally calling. This was not a one-time gesture. This was a courtship. The hours leading up to 3 o'clock were a flurry of panicked activity. The small drawing room was cleaned within an inch of its life. The faded cushions on the settee were plumped, and the best, albeit chipped, tea service was brought out. Seraphina was made to change her dress 3 times before her mother was satisfied. At precisely 3, the sound of a grand carriage stopping outside their modest home sent a new wave of panic through the household. Moments later, the Duke of Blackwood was being announced by their flustered butler. He filled their small drawing room with his presence. Dressed in impeccable day clothes, he was even more imposing up close. He was polite and correct, bowing to her mother and inquiring after her father's health. He accepted a cup of tea, his large hands looking almost comical, holding the delicate china cup. The conversation was stilted at first, with Lady Annalise doing most of the talking, her chatter betraying her nervousness. But Alistair's attention was fixed on Seraphina. He drew her out, asking about the books she was reading, her opinion on a new art exhibit. He listened, truly listened, to her answers, his grey eyes showing a genuine interest that made her forget her own nervousness. Then he turned to Lord Julian, who had been sitting silently, observing the Duke with a wary eye. "Lord Covington," Alistair began, his tone shifting from social to business. "I was reviewing some accounts for my holdings in Yorkshire recently. I have a rather large tract of timberland near Helmsley that has been poorly managed for years. The forestry concern overseeing it has been, to be frank, negligent. I am in need of a new man to take over the management of the entire operation. a man of integrity and good standing. The position comes with a significant salary and a residence on the estate. Lord Julian stared at him, nonplussed. Your Grace, I have no experience in forestry. You have experience in managing men, my lord, Alistair replied smoothly. You ran your family's shipping interests for years. This is a matter of logistics and honesty, not of knowing one tree from another. I am looking for a trustworthy steward. Your grandfather's reputation suggests that such qualities run in your blood. He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. The offer is yours, if you would consider it. Seraphina's teacup rattled in its saucer. She understood immediately what was happening. This was not charity. It was far too clever for that. It was an offer of legitimate, respectable employment for her father, a position that would restore not just their finances, but, more importantly, her father's sense of purpose and dignity. It was a lifeline, offered so skillfully that it could be accepted without shame. It was the most thoughtful, profoundly kind gesture she had ever witnessed. Her father, for the first time in years, sat up straighter. A spark of his old confidence returned to his eyes. Your Grace, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I would be honoured to consider it. Deeply honoured. Alistair simply nodded, as if the matter were settled. He rose to his feet. Excellent. I shall have my solicitor draw up the papers. He turned to Seraphina and her mother. Ladies, it has been a pleasure. After he had gone, the three Covingtons sat in stunned silence. The scent of his sandalwood cologne seemed to linger in the room. He had, in the space of a 30-minute visit, saved her from social ruin, charmed her mother, and restored her father's future. Seraphina looked down at her hands, her heart aching with a powerful, unfamiliar emotion. She had been prepared to sacrifice herself for her family, to marry for duty and security. She had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined that a man like the Duke of Blackwood would not only see her, but would choose to lift her up and to lift her entire family along with her. Her feelings for him were no longer just gratitude. They were transforming into something far deeper, something that felt dangerously like hope. The Duke's courtship of Lady Seraphina Covington became the defining obsession of the London season. He sent flowers daily. He escorted her to the opera, sitting in the Covingtons' modest box, and ignoring the dozens of more prestigious invitations he surely had. He took her for drives in Hyde Park in his gleaming black phaeton, a clear and public statement of his intentions. For Seraphina, it was a dizzying, wonderful dream. With Alistair, she felt she could finally be herself. He appreciated her sharp mind, laughed at her quiet wit, and seemed to find a strange peace in her company, a respite from the demands of his title. But for Lady Isabella Vane, it was a nightmare. She had been publicly humiliated. The man she had intended to capture had not only spurned her, but had elevated her rival to the most coveted position in England. Her fury festered, curdling into a venomous obsession. If she could not have the Duke, she would make certain that the little nobody from Bloomsbury would never be his Duchess. Isabella put her maids and footmen to work, paying them handsomely to dig into the Covington family's past. She knew there had to be something, some forgotten skeleton in their closet that could be used to ruin Seraphina for good. For weeks they found nothing, and then a disgruntled former groom of the Covington family, dismissed years ago for drunkenness, provided the weapon she had been searching for. The whisper campaign began subtly. A hushed comment here, a carefully worded question there. It started with the ladies in Isabella's circle and spread like a contagion through the drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs of Mayfair. The rumour was this: Lord Julian Covington's younger brother, a man named Thomas, had not died of a fever in the West Indies, as the family had always claimed. He had, in fact, been a card sharp and a cheat. He had been caught fixing a high-stakes game with a group of powerful men, and rather than face a duel and certain death, he had fled the country in disgrace, living under an assumed name in America. He had brought dishonor upon the Covington name, a stain that Lord Julian had spent years carefully concealing. In the rigid, honor-bound world of the aristocracy, it was a devastating scandal. It meant the Covington blood was tainted with deceit and cowardice. While it was not Seraphina's fault, the stain of her uncle's disgrace was now hers to bear. A family's name was everything, and theirs, it was now whispered, was worthless. The change in atmosphere was immediate and brutal. Invitations that had begun to pour in for the Covingtons suddenly dried up. Old family friends became distant, offering cool nods instead of warm greetings. When Seraphina entered a room, conversations would cease, replaced by avid, malicious whispers. The very people who had been fascinated by her romance with the Duke now looked at her with pity and scorn. The pressure on Alistair was immense. His advisers, his ancient aunt, who served as his closest confidant, all urged him to end the courtship. "You are the Duke of Blackwood," his solicitor, a dry man named Mr. Finch, told him bluntly. "Your Duchess must be beyond reproach. This girl, whatever her personal merits, is now damaged goods. To marry her would be to bring this scandal into your own house." Seraphina saw the toll it was taking on him. He became more withdrawn, the cold mask occasionally slipping back into place. He never spoke of the rumors to her, and his devotion seemed unwavering, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. She knew he was fighting battles on her behalf, facing down the disapproval of his entire world. The guilt was a heavy stone in her stomach. She was dragging him down. This man who had saved her was now being tarnished by her family's shame. One evening, as they sat in her family's drawing room, the silence thick with unspoken tension, she finally found the courage to speak. "Alistair," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "you should not have to do this. You should not have to defend me. Your name, your family, you have a duty to them." She couldn't bring herself to say the words, but the meaning was clear. "You should leave me." He turned to her, his face grim. He took her hands in his grip firm. "Seraphina, do you believe I am a man who is easily swayed by the gossip of fools? No, but this is different. It is a matter of honor, of family. It is a matter of a man, long dead or disappeared, who made a mistake," he cut in, his voice sharp with frustration. "It has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with the woman I—" He stopped, catching himself. He had not yet spoken of love. Theirs was an understanding, a deep and growing affection, but the word itself remained unsaid. "The woman you are courting," he finished quietly, "I will not be dictated to by the likes of Isabella Vane and her coven of harpies. This is her doing. I know it." "But you cannot prove it," Seraphina whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "And in our world, the rumor is as powerful as the truth. Perhaps more so." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of anger and a deep, aching tenderness. He knew she was right. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a man of immense power, but even he could not single-handedly silence the vicious whispers of the entire London ton. Isabella had chosen her weapon well. It was an attack he couldn't fight head-on without making the scandal even more prominent. He was trapped, and so was she. The final grand ball of the season was to be held at Lancaster House, a glittering affair that felt more like a state function than a party. It was to be Seraphina's ultimate trial by fire. Everyone knew she would be there on the Duke's arm. It would be a final, defiant stand before the London season ended and the aristocracy scattered to their country estates for the summer. The tension was palpable. The entire ton was waiting to see what would happen. Seraphina was terrified. Her father, his new position in Yorkshire secured, had begged her not to go. "We can leave London now, Fina," he'd urged. "We can start over. You don't have to face them." But she knew she had to. To flee would be an admission of guilt and shame. More importantly, she would not abandon Alistair to face the whispers alone. She would stand by his side, head held high, for as long as he would have her. She wore a simple gown of deep blue velvet, a sapphire necklace, a gift from Alistair, her only adornment. It was a picture of understated elegance, a silent rebuke to the gaudy fashions around her. When they entered the ballroom, a wave of silence followed them. It was worse than the night her dress had torn. This was a cold, deliberate shunning. They were an island in a sea of silks and jewels. Alistair's jaw was set like stone, his hand a protective, possessive weight on the small of her back. They had been there for perhaps half an hour, enduring the cold shoulders and veiled insults, when Lady Isabella Vane made her move. She approached them, a triumphant, venomous smile on her face. She was flanked by several of the most powerful and gossipy matrons in London. It was a public tribunal. "Your Grace," Isabella said, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "and Lady Seraphina, how brave of you to attend." Alistair's eyes were chips of ice. "I was not aware bravery was required to attend a party, Lady Isabella." "Oh, but it is," she purred, "when one's family name is so compromised. I was just telling Lady Danbury here how terribly sorry we all are for you, Lady Seraphina, to have the sordid dealings of a cheating uncle dredged up for all the world to see. It is a dreadful burden for you to carry." The attack was direct, brutal, and public. Seraphina felt the blood drain from her face. This was it. The final, killing blow. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but before a sound could escape her lips, Alistair held up a hand, silencing her. He did not look at Isabella. Instead, he turned his body slightly, addressing the crowd that had now openly gathered to watch the confrontation. "Lady Isabella is correct about one thing," he said, his voice ringing with cold clarity. "There is a cheat in our midst." A shocked murmur went through the crowd. Isabella's smile faltered. Alistair continued, his gaze now sweeping the room before landing, with pinpoint accuracy, on a nervous-looking young man standing near the card rooms. "Lord Harrington, would you be so good as to step forward?" The pimply-faced lord who had stepped on Seraphina's toes at the first ball went pale. He looked wildly around, as if searching for an escape. "Lord Harrington," Alistair repeated, his voice like the crack of a whip. "Now." Trembling, Harrington stumbled forward. "Lord Harrington," the Duke said, "you were a witness at the Ashworth ball. You were standing not 10 feet from Lady Seraphina when her gown was torn. Is that correct?" Harrington swallowed hard, nodding mutely. "Tell me, my lord, did you happen to see Lady Isabella Vane's foot as she turned? Did you see the rather deliberate way she extended her heel, catching the fabric? Did you see that it was not, in fact, an accident at all?" Harrington looked at Isabella, his eyes wide with panic. She shot him a look of pure fury, a silent threat. Alistair's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Be very careful how you answer, Harrington, for my memory is quite clear. And unlike some, I do not look kindly upon those who collude with cheats and liars, either at the card table or on the dance floor." The reference to Harrington's own notorious gambling debts was unmistakable. The young lord crumbled. I "I saw it," he stammered, his gaze fixed on the floor. "She did it on purpose. Her heel. It was deliberate." A collective, scandalized gasp filled the ballroom. The accusation, now confirmed, was 1,000 times more shocking than the original rumor. To deliberately tear a lady's gown was an act of unthinkable social violence. Isabella's face was a mask of disbelief and rage. "He's lying! The Duke has threatened him!" But Alistair wasn't finished. He turned back to the crowd, his voice resonating with power and conviction. "You have all been so concerned with the honor of a man who has been gone for 20 years. But you have been blind to the dishonor right here in this room. You have feasted on whispers and lies, fed to you by a malicious bully. You speak of good breeding? Of noble character?" He turned then, his entire focus shifting to Serafina. He took both of her hands in his, ignoring the hundreds of pairs of eyes watching them. His own eyes, those stormy grey seas, were filled with a fierce, undeniable light. "This is character," he declared, his voice softening but still carrying through the hall. "To endure cruelty with grace, to face down shame with courage, to stand tall when the world tries to tear you down." He went down on one knee. The ballroom erupted in a cacophony of shrieks and gasps. In front of the entire London ton, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, was proposing. "Lady Serafina Covington," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Your family's past is meaningless to me. Your heart, your strength, your goodness, that is the only dowry I will ever require. You have made me feel more in these past few weeks than I have felt in my entire life. Will you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife, of becoming my Duchess?" Tears were streaming freely down Serafina's face now, but they were tears of joy, of overwhelming, unbelievable love. The whispers, the scandals, Isabella, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the incredible man kneeling before her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Yes, Alistair. Of course, yes." He rose and slid a magnificent diamond ring onto her finger. Then he leaned in and kissed her, a firm, possessive kiss that left no doubt as to his feelings. The ballroom, after a moment of stunned silence, exploded into applause. They had just witnessed the greatest romantic triumph of the century. Lady Isabella Vane, her face white with fury and humiliation, turned and fled the room, her social career in tatters. Serafina, standing in the arms of her future husband, finally understood. He hadn't just saved her. From the very beginning, he had chosen her. And in a world of lies and gilded cages, their love was the one undeniable truth. And so, a story that began with a malicious tear, and the threat of ruin was mended with the strongest thread of all, a love built on truth and courage. The Duke of Blackwood and his Duchess, Lady Serafina, did not just find happiness. They redefined what it meant to be noble. Their marriage proved that true honor isn't found in a flawless family tree or a perfect reputation, but in the strength of one's character and the loyalty of one's heart. They showed an entire society that kindness is a greater power than cruelty, and that the best response to public shame is a love so profound it silences every whisper. Theirs became a legacy, not of wealth or status, but of a bond forged in adversity and sealed in front of the entire world. What did you think of the Duke's stunning public proposal? Was it the most romantic moment, or was his first act of covering her with his coat the true sign of his love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by Serafina and Alistair's journey, please give this video a like, share it with a fellow romance lover, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more historical dramas that will sweep you away. Thank you for listening.